On social orientation, babies are socially oriented. Face-to-face play often begins to characterize the caregiver and infant interactions at 2 to 3 months. This is going to include vocalization, touch, and gestures. Infants also learn about the social world through the ability to crawl and then walk and then run. They're able to go out physically. We started off talking about the biological. That's the first thing. You have to be able to get up and go out in your environment. Awareness of intentional and goal-directed behavior initially emerges at the end of the first year. And so related to this is going to be what they call social referencing, reading the emotional cues in others to determine how to act. And so this helps the infant to interpret ambiguous situations. Basically, if they're not sure how to react, what they can do is look at the parents to see how they're reacting. If a stranger comes up and the parents are interacting with that stranger and they seem to be in a pleasant mood, the child's going to look at the parents and see, oh, okay, well, the stranger must be okay because the parents think it's okay. Another situation this might happen is if a child falls down. If it hurts, they're immediately going to start screaming. But sometimes what they'll do is look at the parent to decide, okay, how bad was this fall? It's ambiguous. They're not sure. And so if you go, are you okay? Like, no, you freaked them out. You don't want to do that. If it's an ambiguous fall and they're not sure if they're hurt, they're probably not hurt that bad. And what you probably want to do is, you're okay. Go ahead and get up. You're fine. Go with that instead of, oh no. If you go, oh no, then they're going to go, oh no. And that's social referencing. They're looking at you on how to react. On attachment. So at the beginning here, they talk a little bit about Freud. They talk about Harlow, and they talk about Erikson. With Freud's idea was that infants attach to a person or object that provides oral satisfaction, the person that feeds them. Harlow ran some experiments with monkeys that today maybe wouldn't meet ethical standards, but his research showed that contact comfort is a crucial element in developing attachment. And the next one is Erikson. And so with Erikson, he taught his first stage is trust versus mistrust. And this emphasizes the role of physical comfort and sensitive care. And we'll talk more about the Erikson stages throughout some of the other chapters. Bowlby had some ideas on attachment as well. Bowlby, he had 4 phases of attachment. In the first phase, this is birth to 2 months, infants just attach to human figures, strangers, siblings, parents, all kind of, they don't differentiate as well as they do when they get into phase 2, which is going to be about 2 months of age. At this point, attachment is focused on usually just one figure, the primary caregiver, and the baby learns to distinguish familiar from unfamiliar people. Phase 3, this is 7 to 24 months. Specific attachments develop, and with increased locomotion, again, the ability to go out in the environment, the infant will go out and seek contact with other people. Phase 4, this is 24 months on. Children become aware of others' feelings, their goals, their plans, and they begin to take these into account when they are forming their own actions. What Bowlby, he argued that infants develop this internal working model of attachment. They have a good idea of the caregiver and their relationship to the caregiver, and they begin to understand themselves as worthy of deserving the care that the caregiver is giving them. This influences the infant's and later the child's subsequent responses to other people. So this interaction that they're having with the caregiver, do they respond appropriately to me? Do they help me when I'm having issues? Basically, are people good? And that this idea of attachment and how people respond to you is something that you could carry later on in life. So they develop these expectations of the caregiver's behaviors, and then later on, how other people are going to respond to you. On some individual differences in attachment, they talk about the strain situation. This was created by Ainsworth. We talked about her a little bit ago. How this works, this is an experiment. The infant experiences a series of introductions, separations, and reunions with the caregiver and an adult stranger. Basically, the kid and the parent, they go into a room. The parent leaves, a stranger comes in, and they see how the child reacts to the stranger. Stranger leaves, mom or whoever the caregiver comes back in. And then they see how the child reacts to the parent coming back. Securely attached babies will use the caregiver as a secure base from which to explore the environment. So when they're in the room together, the baby will go out and look at the environment. Maybe they'll check back on the parent and see if, The social referencing type stuff, go back to the parent, go back and forth, go in the environment, etc. These are how securely attached babies work. Insecure avoidant babies show insecurity by avoiding the caregiver. So when the mom comes back into the room, the baby's like, whatever, I'm not even going to bother going over to the mom. That's insecure avoidant. Insecure resistant babies, they go back and forth. So they will cling to the caregiver and then resist the closeness. So they won't want the parent to leave, and they'll grab hold of them and won't let them go. But then when you try to hold on to them, they'll push back and scream about it. The final one is the insecure disorganized baby. They are disorganized. They seem disoriented, perhaps fearful. It's hard to gauge where they're at mentally and emotionally. On this strange situation, as a measure of attachment, it may be culturally biased. So we've talked a little bit about culture in this chapter and how in some cultures you're supposed to subdue your emotions more than in other cultures. And so it probably relates to this too. Like when they do cross-cultural studies, and they compare these in the US and places in Europe and places in Asia, there's differences in how these attachment styles are demonstrated. Another problem maybe with strange situation is it's in the laboratory and it doesn't necessarily mirror a natural environment. And few studies have measured the attachment with the mother and the father separately, but the ones that have shown the infants that are double insecure with both their mom and their dad will exhibit more problems later on. It's possible. There are quite a few studies that do talk about, that reveal the power of attachment to predict subsequent development. Basically, secure attachment in a lot of cases will lead to positive emotional health, high self-esteem, self-confidence, and being socially competent. At the other end, with disorganized, more likely to be aggressive and hostile. Consistently positive caregiving is likely an important factor here. A term that they have that goes along with this is the developmental cascade model. The connections across domains over time influence developmental outcomes. And I've talked a little bit about an idea similar to this before, the idea of the road you start to go down. You come to a fork in the road, and these happen. You start off somewhere along the path with your genes, and then your environment is going to help where you go down. We've talked about this, I know, with intelligence, but it's the same thing kind of with this attachment stuff. You're going to start here at this set point, and then how you interact with the environment is going to how you end up. And so, yes, again, if you're maybe a little bit difficult when you're born, and then you have parents that are not the best, it could split you off down this road and can lead to potentially a lot of negative outcomes. That being said, there are a few criticisms of attachment theory that too much emphasis has been placed on attachment bond in infancy. And a lot of this actually relates back to Freud. Freud has fallen out of favor in the last few decades. But when he first came along, he placed a lot of emphasis on infancy, and maybe some of it's maybe deserved and maybe some of it's not. Again, we do have, although there's continuity, there is also the capacity for change. The diversity of socializing agents and contexts is often ignored. So for an example, maybe instead of it being that you have an insecure attachment, maybe you just have a low tolerance for stress. Maybe you have a gene like 5-HTT-LPR. We talked about it in relation to depression or way early on. It's also linked to having this low tolerance for stress. And so maybe you have this gene, and that's why you don't do so well on some of these measurements of attachment. And so it's not about your attachment, it's about your genes. With attachment and the caregivers, securely attached babies have caregivers who are sensitive to their signals and consistently available to respond to their kids' needs. Caregivers of avoidant or insecure attached babies tend to be unavailable or rejecting. They often do not respond to their baby's signals, and they have little physical contact with them. When they do interact, they are angry and irritable. Caregivers of disorganized babies often will either neglect them or even, in some cases, physically abuse them. With the developmental social neuroscience and attachment is one of the main areas in which this theory and research on developmental social neuroscience is focused. Brain imaging studies show connections among infants' cues, such as crying, and then the mother's responses in brain activity. There's some hormones at work here too, like oxytocin. You may have heard of this one before. And the neurotransmitter dopamine are important to the formation of the maternal and infant bond. Oxytocin, example, is released in the mother during breastfeeding and by the contact and the warmth of the baby.